Welcome to Big Ideas in Science. In this series, I'm going to be talking about theories, ideas, and discoveries that have revolutionized science and the world. It's no secret that the time we live in is an embarrassment of riches with regards to knowledge. Obviously, we have the benefit of all of the knowledge that has been accumulated historically, but also around 2.5 million scientific papers are published every year. You'd think that at that rate, there must be new scientific revolutions happening every couple of hours, but there aren't. Virtually all discoveries add some fine-tuning to what we already know. The new mRNA vaccines that were developed for COVID are revolutionary, but nowhere near as revolutionary as the first vaccines. Computers get smaller, faster, and more efficient, but there haven't been any fundamental changes in computers since the 1970s. When we say history, we automatically think of the past. But when we say that something or someone changed history, we mean it changed the future. The big ideas in science are the ones that changed the course of history. As we learn about these big ideas, we will begin first by analyzing what the world was like and what ideas were held prior to their discovery. Next, we will look at which historical figures, organizations, places, and events were at the heart of that big idea. And finally, we will touch on how that big idea changed history and why it is so important. In this video, I will be discussing the invention of science itself. Let's get started. I've been a high school science teacher for 8 years, and I've been making YouTube videos for over 3.5 years. This is probably the 4th or 5th video about what is science that I've made, and okay, I get that it can start to be a little old, but science is one of the most important ideas we ever came up with. You got agriculture, writing, math, science. There, that's it. That's the list. Let's begin with what science is. A little while ago, I said that science is an invention. Science wasn't discovered or revealed to us, we made it up. That's how inventions work. You wouldn't say that Joseph Priestley invented oxygen, he discovered it. And you wouldn't say that Thomas Edison discovered the light bulb, he invented it. Science was a change in the way we try to understand the world and look for true cause and effect. Typically, when we think of inventions, we think of objects, not ideas. But ideas are inventions too. Math was revolutionized by the invention of the concept of irrational and imaginary numbers. Science revolutionized the world by guiding us in how we study reality. Science can be defined as the study of the natural world through observation and experiment. Scientists don't just make claims, they test them. For every one new discovery about how something works, 1,000 incorrect explanations are thrown out. We'll get into this in more detail soon, but the idea that you should test a claim is the crucial difference between science and other antiquated ways of thinking. Science is also replicable. It can be repeated and objectively verified. Go and talk to 10 different psychics, and you'll get 10 different answers to what your future might hold. Run 10 different experiments on what happens when you drop a hammer, and you'll get 10 identical results. It goes down. All right, let's dive into the world before science. Humans are remarkably intelligent creatures. I mean, we do stuff like this. But we have also landed on the moon, eradicated smallpox, created the internet, and more. Our curiosity and intelligence is a blessing, but it can lead us astray. We obsessively look for patterns, cause and effect, agency, meaning, and purpose. And when none of those things can easily be assigned to a phenomenon, say the sun moving across the sky, then we come up with an answer anyways, despite our ignorance. This is how we end up with an entire planet of humans all believing the sun goes around the earth for thousands upon thousands of years. Now, there's nothing wrong with thinking intuitively rather than scientifically most of the time. The vast majority of people don't do or think anything scientifically as they go about their normal business, and we seem to be doing just fine. If that's the case, then what do we need science for? Rather than answering that question directly, let's continue with alternative ways of thinking, and hopefully the virtues of science will become self-evident to you. The precursor to science is often said to be philosophy, But philosophy is also an invention, and we haven't always done philosophy. So what's the precursor to philosophy? What's the earliest version of how we tried to understand the world? Well, there are our senses, but those are highly limited. We all have them, they aren't passed down through culture, and they're not uniquely human. The answer, it seems to me, is simple trial and error. By taking our best guess, getting lucky, repeating the same miserable procedure 1,000 times over, exploring new ways of doing things, we slowly evolved our culture. Tools, clothing, agriculture, hunting, writing systems, art, music were almost certainly invented this way. On the surface, this seems respectable. But the problem is you're going to be living in a world where the march of progress is more like a crawl. In fact, crawl is too generous of a word. It's closer to a standstill. If we teleported to the year 1000 BCE, observed what was going on around the world, then teleported 1,000 years into the future, we would find people living and doing basically the exact same things. Now just think about how much different, and also better, the world has become in just the last 100 years. The problem with trial and error is it isn't very innovative. Sometimes you don't have much of a choice because you are limited by the knowledge or technology of your day. In the mid-1900s, scientists were desperate to come up with new varieties of crops that would produce more food for the rapidly growing human population. But they had no idea how to do this. For years, they blasted crops with radiation in the hope that a 1 in a billion beneficial mutation would occur, but it never did. Theoretically, at some point it would, but that's exactly what I mean by the painfully slow rate of progress. It's also hard to see how trial and error itself would lead to any new discoveries. Now let's be fair, trial and error was how Dutch glass workers invented lenses that allowed the first microscopes to be invented, which led to quite a large number of discoveries. But glass was invented 5,000 years before glass lenses. Compare that to the scientific process that allowed humanity to go from the first powered flight to landing on the moon in just 66 years. Moving on to philosophy. Philosophy is the study of general and fundamental questions about things, such as existence, reason, knowledge, etc. Philosophy is deeply ingrained into every culture around the world, and you could easily argue it has been more influential than science. Science can't answer every question. You can't use science to conclude that Leonardo was a great painter, or that The Godfather is a good movie. Philosophy guides us on how to think, and we use it to shape our morals, societal structures, write laws, and countless other things. We use science to figure out what we can do, but we use philosophy to figure out what we should do, among other things. But philosophy has never made a single discovery. You can't prove anything by doing philosophy. But that's not how philosophy was treated historically. Our intelligence was viewed as a divine gift, and therefore by using reason and logic alone, you could prove anything. Ancient philosophers didn't think it was highly likely that the sun orbits the earth. They knew it was true. The idea of proving a philosophical claim using evidence and experimentation was unthinkable. Philosophers were high-ranking members of society, and experimentation was looked at as the kind of thing that peasants or slaves would do. Manual labor? Oh no, that's for the common folk. Did I just imitate Greek philosophy with a pretentious British accent? We'll edit that part out. To illustrate how absurd this line of thinking is, and how pathologically they took their beliefs, Aristotle thought that men had more teeth than women, and he had a wife. The most influential philosopher in history thought something that you'd only have to look at once to disprove, and he never did. Then there was the Greek philosopher Hipparchus. Hipparchus thought, perhaps, that maybe the Earth and other planets go around the sun, and he was also a mathematician, so he worked on this problem. This work eventually led Hipparchus to realize that if you assume the planets go around the sun, then they must do so in ellipses, not perfect circles, which is true. That discovery of the truth of the matter led Hipparchus to reject his theory. According to him, and everybody else, objects in the universe had to move in perfect circles. So if the math was telling him that planets go around the sun in ellipses, then the math has to be wrong. Our intuitions are correct. Nothing in the universe is more objective than math. But again, this was not the attitude that they held. What made matters worse was thinking for yourself also seemed to be somewhere between a foreign concept and an illegal one. Having a controversial opinion was punishable by death in most societies for most of history. Just ask Giordano Bruno. As a social species, we also tend to trust high-ranking, influential members of our societies. There are good reasons for doing this, but it's not consequence-free. Now, I'm not trying to insult philosophy, even if that is what Diogenes would want. The point is that a world where people did the best possible philosophy, but absolutely no science, would be a terrible world. So that's a glimpse of the world before the invention of science. Now let's talk about the invention of science. Admittedly, we have some problems here. Science isn't an object like the light bulb, and while there is such a thing as science, it wasn't spontaneously created one day by some guy. Science gradually evolved, and still is evolving. Is it possible to do science without doing experiments, which seem to be the crux of science? Oftentimes, we run simulations as opposed to true experiments to draw conclusions. We can't make black holes or experiment with them, but by following the math and making predictions, we found black holes, and they behaved exactly as we predicted. So yes, we can do science without experiments. There are different kinds of experiments as well. More on that in a bit. Perhaps in the future, humans won't even do science. It will only be done by computers. That may sound odd, but human beings make errors that computers don't. So we would likely be better off by not being the ones who do science. Okay, so when did science originate? Should we look for the first experiment? Around the year 240 BCE, Archimedes ingeniously figured out a way to test experimentally whether the king of Syracuse's crown was pure gold, then allegedly ran through the town shouting, "Eureka!" butt naked, since he was taking a bath when the idea came to him. But for reasons we have discussed, 2,262 years ago was certainly not the beginning of the scientific age, and it's highly unlikely that nobody before Archimedes ran an experiment of their own. How about instead we look for the author of the scientific method? Multiple problems here. Typically, the steps of the scientific method are written as follows, but there's no such thing as the scientific method. Proper scientific experiments are supposed to have a control group, and the first known controlled experiment was a study on scurvy in 1753, long after the days of Copernicus, Galileo, and Isaac Newton. Besides that, we don't know who came up with the modern scientific method as we know it. Ibn al-Haytham in the 11th century may be the earliest candidate. Many credit Francis Bacon for outlining the scientific method in 1620, but I personally don't see enough of a difference between Bacon and al-Haytham. How about a paradigm shift? How about the birth of using science to overturn the errors of philosophy and discover the truth? The scientific revolution. What's nice is there is a date we can put on this, 1543. That was the year Nicholas Copernicus died, and his book on the revolutions of heavenly spheres was published. This book famously argued against geocentrism and postulated that the Earth goes around the sun. But here's the thing, the book doesn't prove anything. Copernicus's math was also abysmal. This book does not contain data on experiments demonstrating Earth goes around the sun, nor did it contain instructions on how someone in the future should do those experiments. But there's no question that the book was a key inspiration to those who would go on to make those kinds of discoveries. It was such a powerful and potent book that the Vatican banned it and only allowed copies with parts about heliocentrism removed to be circulated. The first revolutionary discovery, literally, was made by Galileo. Galileo didn't discover or prove that Earth goes around the sun, but he did discover Jupiter's 4 largest moons with the telescope. This was the first incontrovertible proof that something in the universe orbits something other than the Earth. Galileo then wrote a book arguing the positions between heliocentrism and geocentrism, which he had the blessing of Cardinal Bellarmine to do, because believing in or teaching heliocentrism directly was blasphemy and a crime. Of course, Galileo was charged with a crime he didn't commit, submitted proof of his innocence to the Inquisition, who didn't care, found him guilty anyways, banned him from teaching heliocentrism, and placed him under house arrest for the rest of his life. But Galileo was not the first to disprove the old philosophers with real-world evidence. We don't know who the first person was, but it may have been his father, Vincenzo. Vincenzo was a lute player, and in his time, all lute players sounded awful. Not because they were unskilled, but because they were out of tune. 2,000 years before Vincenzo, Pythagoras and his weird religious cult, who banned eating beans, starting fires, and touching white roosters, came up with many discoveries. For example, the Pythagorean theorem, as well as irrational numbers. They also discovered some properties of music. This note is an E. Then we have F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, B flat, B, C, C sharp, D, E flat, and another E. This E, the octave higher, is produced by making the exact same string under the same tension half the length. This means that the sound is vibrating at twice the frequency. If I pluck this note, that's a D note. If I bend the string, I increase the tension, raising its pitch. I can turn this D note into an E note that way. Stringed instruments have these tuning pegs, which change the tension to create the pitch you want. According to Pythagoreans, to turn a low E note into an E an octave higher, you must double the tension in the string. It must follow the pattern observed by the length of the string. Because they were geniuses in some ways, everybody believed the Pythagoreans must be right. But when it comes to string tension, this is dead wrong. By carefully doing the experiments himself at his house, Vincenzo and a young Galileo proved that to make a string resonate an octave higher, twice the frequency, you must quadruple the tension. If you wanted to increase the pitch by 2 octaves, 3 times the frequency, then the tension would have to be 9 times higher, 3 squared. This discovery is still relevant today. I have a box of guitar strings here, and the tension for each note, for each string, is given. This experience unquestionably inspired Galileo, who would go on to disprove Aristotle's theories of motion by showing that all objects fall at the same rate if you can eliminate air resistance. A feather and a hammer, he said, would fall at the same rate if not for air resistance. And so, the scientific age was born. Not that anybody exactly noticed at the time. Progress is a slow and steady kind of thing. It's not like the world became rational as soon as science was invented. Many of the discoveries we regard as obvious today were not at all obvious to people in the past, which isn't completely their fault. For example, after reading On the Origin of Species, where Darwin laid down the arguments for evolution by natural selection, Thomas Henry Huxley famously said, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." But the scene was set. Science would forever change the world the same way it took decades for electricity to sweep the nation following Edison's light bulb. But it was inevitable that it would. And although there seems to be plenty of irrationality, superstition, and flat-out stupidity, there's never been a better time to be alive. Nothing can stop the march of progress that science grants us. People not taking vaccines isn't the same as vaccines not being developed. Believing in a flat Earth isn't as bad as canceling all of NASA's projects. 150 years ago, people imagined we'd all travel around the world in personal blimps because they couldn't possibly have imagined cars and airplanes. We have no idea how amazing the future will be. In his book, Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker says that science is humanity's crowning achievement. He mentions that, yes, accomplishments in human rights are serious, but those achievements were the result of us overcoming obstacles we put in our own path. We created slavery, then abolished it. Although overcoming a heroin addiction may be a more important feat than earning your master's degree, you wouldn't put it on your resume. Science not only is our crowning achievement, but also our saving grace. It has and will continue to lift people out of poverty, rescue them from disease, overcome dangerous superstitions and biases, reduce bigotry and ignorance, and reveal the universe that exists before us. That is our first big idea. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, click on the link in the description for this video to visit my Patreon page, or just go to patreon.com/planetpeterson. Your support allows me to keep making videos and improves this channel in so many ways. You can contribute for as little as 10 cents a day. There are added benefits to being a Patreon member, including suggesting topics for future videos, early access to videos, and more. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit the bell so you can be notified when new videos come out. That way you can be one of the very first to view and comment on the video, which makes it way more likely that I will see your comment and be able to respond to you. You can also find me on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter by searching Planet Peterson. I'll see you next time.